another 9 sessions after this one today. We've gotten into grammar now. We've moved away from the sound system and writing or having a direct focus on it. But as we go along, there may be questions that arise about the sound system or the writing. So feel free to ask questions at any time, either before or after the sessions or during. And sometimes during the session, like if I get, depending on how far I get with the plurals today, I'll have to make reference to the sound system. Like I might tell you, well, when you form this kind of plural, you have to soften a back K and make a back X out of it in order to form the plural. Say for zok, you don't say zok zok, but zach zok, where you soften it. So that I'll be making use of these terms and concepts that I introduced to you over the past fortnight, the past 2 weeks. That's Australian English is a fortnight. So these new terms we're using are not really just for the sake of talk or developing jargon, but they're new ways of organizing the world of our experience. And the world of our experience that is of interest to us in this particular class is Sam'alyach, so that I'm introducing you to linguistics, which is a subject you could study at university, but I'm doing it specifically with reference to Sam'alyach. You'll see, well, if you think back to your days at school, high school, or some of you may have been at university, the things that we take for granted, like wood, the material around us in buildings, the water, air, and so forth, that actually those can be the subjects of scientific study and takes you right into physics and chemistry, where the things that aren't at all apparent, once you learn the new terminology, the new way of thinking, you begin to see that part of your experience differently. Well, the same with the language, but our motivations in this class are not simply to study language for the sake of studying language, or because it's fun to do, or it's intellectually pleasing, all of which are true. I mean, I get a real great aesthetic pleasure out of doing linguistics. But our interests in this class are doing it so as to feed back to help us develop more effective ways of teaching the language to children, although, as I've said before, we can't do that just in the school. The family, the home, and the community has to take primary responsibility and do that. But from this class, we can get some idea of not only how to do it better in the classroom, but how we might support families, households, and the community in the teaching of Sam'alyach and trying to rebuild its speech community and to strengthen it. Amongst other things, that might include trying to get some radio time or some television time where people hear the language in public. And it's not simply that 1 hour a week of radio or TV is going to be enough, but just the very fact of putting it in public and using it publicly does a great deal to raise its status, not only amongst our own people, but amongst the Amxiwa, who will then have to take it seriously. Well, to move back to the material we've been looking at in the first hour, or we looked at the first hour yesterday and the day before, to grammatical categories and processes, we are doing a bit of a rapid overview of some major features of the morphology of the language and the syntax of the language. Morphology has to do with how you make up words or how you build words. from smaller elements, what we've been calling stems and prefixes and suffixes, or to introduce another linguistic term, how we build up words from morphemes. Morphemes are these elemental units of structure that include stems and affixes and suffixes and so forth. But I introduced to you the notion of, in order to do this rapid survey, which is taking several days, the notions of grammatical categories and processes. Grammatical categories have to do with kinds of meanings, like the meanings between singular and plural number, future tense and non-future tense, masculine, feminine, neuter, notions like that. I've only given a few just by way of example, but each language will have its own set of grammatical categories, although across languages these tend to be very similar, and that's what makes it easy for humans to learn one of those languages as second languages under the right conditions, and it's certainly involved in first language learning too. The grammatical processes are the ways in which languages make manifest or make apparent, the way they signify their grammatical categories. So we had the example of Swahili where you have singular and plural number, and we could see it was the prefixes that gave us the evidence that Swahili has a distinction between singular and plural. Whereas in English we saw it's mainly suffixation that marks the plural, but English also utilizes ablaut in words, pairs of words like man and men, to indicate the difference between singular and plural. By the way, when I was going over my handout last night and redoing it, it's one that I've used before, but I've changed it especially for us. I should have, rather than use ablaut, which is a technical term, I perhaps might have been better to call it internal change. You know, changing the vowels, a vowel or vowels and or the consonants within the stem of a form is known as internal change. And again, sort of in review right now, I've been introducing a lot of new terms to you. Technical concepts may not be completely clear as we go along, but I'll try to help that by reviewing and by giving out handouts. But thinking in terms of my being here for just the 4 weeks, I think in talking with some of the others, it's probably a good use of my time to try to cover as much of the material as I can now in as reasonable a fashion, but in the thought that for some of you may want to go back over to look at the videos later, to look at the transcripts from the videos, if you don't understand everything right now, if you want to reinforce your learning. So if I get too far in front, pull me back, ask questions as we go along, but I know that I am pushing you and that I'm giving a lot of material, but that's in the, for just this specific context. If I were here for a month or 6 months, another time I wouldn't try to push this far. Well, we've gone through 4 grammatical processes so far: affixation, ablaut, compounding, and suppletion. We spent a lot of time on yesterday. Compounding simply where normally you put 2 independent words together to form a new word, as in will and habas, which you can put together and form a new word, wilhabas, which has a distinctive stress pattern. It's wilhabas, not wilhabas. It means that's not simply barn hay or house grass, but the whole thing together has the meaning of a barn or a shed for hay, wilphabas. And there were a couple of other kinds of compounds, what I call the cranberry type and the eventide type, which are found in English, and similar kinds of compound words are found in Somalic, and we went over examples of those. And as I said, it's a very important way of building new words, or building words in Somalic. Then we went on to suppletion, which involves forms that are closely related to each other, forms that belong to the same paradigm, or the same family of words, closely related. A paradigm is a set of related forms, but where the two forms don't sound like each other, don't look like each other because, you know, they're written differently. The way they're written reflects the way they sound. Suppletion involves such things as the word, you can see it in the word get, man, in the sense of a male person, but if you want to say man, you use a completely different sounding form, which is singular and plural, but they don't look anything alike. They don't sound at all alike. We had a similar form in the word that means to run away or to flee, but when we run away, we don't we don't form it like a regular plural, but it would be demud, nu, where you see hood, the plural, and kek don't look anything alike, or don't sound alike. Now I'd like to move on to selection and order. Selection and order, which are the two final grammatical processes. And I'll talk about selection first. Let me perhaps in introducing it, talk about overt and covert grammatical categories. With overt grammatical categories, you can look at a word and immediately get some idea of what its category membership is. You know, there'll be a prefix or a suffix that tells you it's singular or plural. Or if we look at the English word actor, and compare it with the word actress, this is male, masculine, this is feminine. The evidence for actress being feminine is seen in this suffix here, actor, actress, poet, poetess. Author, authoress, we don't do that. We don't have a whole set of, we don't use a lot of these. But how do we know that words like queen, Mary, the woman, how do we know that those are feminine words, feminine gender words? If you look at them, there's no part of the queen that, you know, signals that the queen is feminine in gender. There's no part of the woman that tells us that it's feminine in gender. There's nothing in Mary, you know, there's no morpheme we can segment out that tells us that it's feminine. We all, of course, know that those are feminine in English, but how do we establish that they are feminine? Well, if we replace them with a pronoun. I saw the Queen. I saw the Queen. If we want to replace Queen with a pronoun, can we say I saw him? No, I saw her. Where, you see, a word like Queen is replaced by she or her. It's replaced by a feminine pronoun. I saw the woman. Again, I saw her. I saw Mary. Again, if I want to pronominalize to replace Mary with a pronoun, I use the feminine pronoun there. So, in the case of words like queen, woman, and Mary, the feminine gender is a covert grammatical category. There's nothing in the words themselves that tell us they're feminine, but we get evidence for that covert grammatical category by the process of selection. Selection is where one form gives evidence for its category membership by selecting another form. By selecting another form. To give another example of this, take the English word sheep. You have one sheep, two sheeps, three sheeps? No, one sheep, two sheep, three sheep. Sheep is one of those forms which doesn't change between singular and plural. It doesn't have an overt mark for plurality. But yet, you know, boy and boys, you can see the overt mark for plurality here, sheep and sheep. How can we tell when sheep is singular and when it's plural? Well, you can't tell just by hearing the word in isolation, but if you put it into a sentence, and say, this sheep is an old ewe, this sheep, we can tell that it's singular because we use the singular this, and because it selects for the singular demonstrative pronoun, and it selects a singular verb. On the other hand, if you have sheep in a sentence such as, these sheep are old ewes, or these sheep are wethers. A wether is a castrated male, like a steer. But we can tell that sheep, in the case of these sheep are, that we can tell that it is covertly marked for plural number by the way it selects for the plural form of the demonstrative and for plural verb agreement. Plural verb agreement. Now, there are similar sorts of distinctions in Somalia, where selection operates, where there are covert grammatical categories that are part of the grammar of the language, but you can't look at the word and find a mark for them, and I'll illustrate that in a minute. And I put this word on the board to see if anybody knows it or uses it, lemato. Lemato. Anyone know lemato? I see that Mrs. Ryan does. Lemato. It's a word which I learned when I first came here, but it's a word for sheep, domestic sheep, for domestic sheep, as opposed to debe or dawi or dawe, which are the wild mountain sheep there. But this lemato I gather, has not been continued on in the language, but it ultimately comes from French, le mouton, and it could have been borrowed from the Hudson's Bay Company man who spoke French, or it could have been borrowed from Chinook, the Chinook trade language, in which lemato was the word. Remember we were talking the other day about words like les blades and les poils as words that ultimately come from French. But what I want to do now is to show you how we can get evidence that words like hanak, woman, well, let's take what word would most of you use for mountain sheep? Debet? Debet is one way. Some people have slightly different, but debet for mountain sheep. And lo'op, stone. And we're looking for evidence now of covert grammatical categories of humanness, animateness, but not including humans, and then what we might call an inanimate category. If we try to segment hanak and debet and lo'op into smaller parts, well, we can, hanak perhaps is related to nak, dress, skirt, but that doesn't have to do with humanness per se. Debet we can't segment, and this, by the way, debet or dawe, those are words that have been borrowed into Algech from Silmamach and the Athabascan languages. And you might ask me now, well, how do you know that we've borrowed them? Maybe we loaned them to those people there. Well, the evidence for that, the way one answers that question is you look at the Athabascan languages, which are spoken all the way from up in the Yukon country, out to Sarcee on the northern plains. Then there were a couple down in southern British Columbia, in the Thompson Valley. There were a couple of Athabascan languages at the mouth of the Columbia River. There's a half dozen or so in southwestern Oregon and California, like Hoopa, the Hoopa Reservation in California. They speak the language, an Athabascan language. And then the Navajo and Apaches. And the Navajo and various Apache groups in Arizona and New Mexico. And in virtually all the Athabascan languages, the word for mountain sheep, where they have them, and domestic sheep will be debet or something like that. So that it just, in terms of the scheme of things, for them to have borrowed the word here and then spread to the north and everywhere, it involves all sorts of migrations in order to support that. Whereas if you simply make the hypothesis that we borrowed at some time in the past from the local people, the local Athabascans, it involves much less historical conjecture. And also the fact that it occurs in different forms, like debet, dawe, in Gitksan and Niskaam, indicates that it was borrowed from different Athabascan languages.
Well, I think most of them through trade, that's how they get
Yeah, yeah. But while it's a loan word, it's very old, and I mean, it's our word now. It's not that it belongs to them, anything like that. Just as English, you know, more than half its vocabulary is borrowed from other languages. The borrowing of words from other languages is one very normal way of expanding or making the vocabulary richer. But anyway, come back to here. How do we know that Hanak is human, Tibet is animate but not human, and Lo is inanimate? What's the evidence for it? Well, the evidence is seen in the numbers, the number system. In English, there's just, you know, one number system, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like that. But as all of you know, there's at least 3 different ways of saying the numeral, the number 1. There is ki'i, or ki'i, kek, or kek, or kul, kul. And what we then ask is if you want to count, and then there are numbers like gilbil, and wakadil, and is there another word for 2? Can't think of it right now, but anyway, there's 3 different number series. So that if we're counting humans, how will we say 1 woman? Depchat. Good. 1 woman would be amkul. So amkul hanak. Can we say amkul debak? No, sounds strange. It would be okay, amkak. And can we say amkul lo'op? No, amkil lo'op. Hard K, I, hard Y, H, O, ki'it lo, and so forth. Bakadil hanak, which is number 2 for sheep. 2. Tepchat, Tibet, and gilbil lo. Okay. But you see, the evidence, the way these covert grammatical categories become known to us, whether we realize it or not, is the way they select numbers. They're covert grammatical categories, and these illustrate the process of selection, the process of selection. Okay, now I'd like to move on to order. And I'll come back to selection a bit because I want to do another grammatical category. But order has to do simply with the linear position, you know, the linear position, you know, whether it's something is in front of or following or after or before some other element. And in the grammars of languages, the order of the morphemes or the order of the words in sentences or phrases is important. We did a series of forms the other day with the prefix ha, as in ha'dak, ha'aks, and so forth. And that order is important. You can't say ax ha or duck ha. You have to have the ha before the duck, the ha before the ax. It's extremely important. Similarly, the order of words in some Algach sentences is important. And I'd like to first do a bit of a contrast with English, do a bit of English, and then do the contrast, show how with some Algach the basic order of constituents or the main parts of a sentence is different, and then use the frame, the sentence frame that I've established to give you evidence for the grammatical category of proper nouns and common nouns. But notice in English that the normal order of the major constituents in a sentence is subject, verb, object. Subject, verb, object. The subject of a sentence, the verb of a sentence, and I'll call it the direct, be a bit more specific, the direct object of a verb. And if you remember back to your school grammar, a verb plus a direct object is one kind of predicate. One kind of predicate. Now we'll see these categories of subject, verb, and object, they're found in some Algach too. You didn't realize it, but you've been using them all along, and they're extremely important. But to go back to English, the order of the subject, verb, and object is extremely important to the full meaning of the sentence. The subject is the noun phrase generally that occurs before the verb at the beginning of the sentence, and typically the subject is the agent or the performer of some action. You know, it's the man who did something, namely the man saw the woman. The verb typically will signify some event or some activity or some action that the subject has performed, and the direct object is the person or entity that is affected by, has been acted upon by the subject, or has been affected by the action signified in the verb. If I take these same words and shift them around and say, the wife saw her husband, or if I say his wife saw the man, his wife saw the man, perhaps isn't quite the best, but it implies that they're not husband and wife. But let me just go ahead and do that. His wife saw the man. Same words, different meaning, but a good part of the difference of meaning is that we now have his wife as the subject of the sentence. His wife is the one who's performing the action, the activity. And we have the man as the object of the verb, the person who you're not really affected when you're seen, at least not materially, but the recipient of the action there, the patient it sometimes is called. Now, we know that in some Algach, if we just take words in isolation, that the word for man, right in Western, is get, that the word for see is ga, and the word for his wife is next. But if we string these together in the English way, get, next, it's broken Indian, it's baby Indian. It just doesn't fit together, doesn't mean anything. We're leaving something out and we're putting it into the wrong order. So we need to do something to it. if we put the words together like this in this order, and we use these HLs right here to connect the words, the connectives, get, next, get, next. We've translated that meaning. The man saw his wife. And notice that the order is verb, subject, direct object. Verb, subject, direct object. It's the basic order of nouns and verbs in Somalica. Very different from English, but there are many other languages of the world that have VSO ordering. Irish Gaelic, for example, is a language which is VSO. Another one just doesn't come to mind right now. How about if we take next and get and interchange them? Get, next, get. Does that, it has a different meaning, but get, next, get. Pardon? People, okay. His wife saw the man, or get there could mean saw people, because get has several senses. It can be, you know, a singular male, adult male person, or it can be a group of people together, what we call a collective plural, get, whereas get is a different kind of plural, but it too means plural. But notice verb, subject, object. Now, all I'm trying to do right now is to illustrate the importance of order as a grammatical process in Somalic grammar. But we can use these frames right here to establish another kind, the existence of another grammatical category. In English, there's a distinction that's made between proper nouns and common nouns, and the proper nouns, amongst other things, include personal names. So you might say, the man saw the woman, but you wouldn't say the man saw the Mary. The man saw the Mary. Typically proper names, which are kind of proper nouns, they don't take determiners like the and a, and so forth there. We might ask, well, what's the evidence in Somalic for the existence of a category of proper noun? Well, what if we wanted to say, the man saw Mary? Get, to marry. If I say, get marry, I can see from the look on your faces it doesn't sound right. See, because I'm not following the rules correctly of Somalic grammar. I'm treating Mary as though it were, or she were, a common noun. But proper nouns, we'll see, it's perhaps unfortunate I've chosen a word that ends in a T there, because they tend to just say get marry. But if you slow it down, get to marry, you can hear it then.
That's just, the people saw Mary, it's not a man saw Mary.
Okay, the people then would be good translation there. The people saw Mary, where that particular sense of get comes forth. is most important. On the other hand, if we want to say, Mary saw the people, could we say, Ga'as Mary get? No, what do we have to say? Ga'as. Ga'as Mary. But here, Ga'as Mary get. Now, what I'm giving you evidence for, and I'll come back to this later on, is that there is a category of proper nouns and of common nouns. The proper nouns include all personal names, certain senior kinship terms, you know, like niyet, nitzitz, those are proper nouns. Words like tun and tust are proper nouns. I think that may be it. And so far I've just, and the evidence for it, you can't see in the noun itself, there's no morpheme that means proper as opposed to common. But the evidence for the categories of proper nouns and common nouns come in these things that are called connectives. If it's a common noun, you'll get th on the word before the common noun. If it's a proper noun, it gets t immediately before the noun, and that t is the singular proper noun. If I wanted to say, I saw Mary and Fred, Ga'i dip Mary and Fred, where dip is the plural proper noun, is the, tells you that this whole noun phrase right here is plural. Get, so, get, dip Mary, gunt Fred. The people saw Mary and Fred. Sound all right? Maybe. Dip Mary, gunt Fleddy. And for those of you who are school teachers and who are experienced, with what sometimes is called village English or village or red English, that you could also say get dip Mary, and the dip Mary means translated to be like Mary and them in English. But as you know, in village English, children will often say, I saw them marry, which is a direct loan translation of the grammar of Somalia carried on over into English.
The amazing part is it's the group that don't even speak the Indian or Gitksan that are using that in their English.
That's a really good point, and let me spend a little bit of time developing that. Margaret was just saying that it's interesting that the children who use forms like dip Mary, dip Fred, dip Bruce, and so forth, are the children, in most cases, who don't speak Somalic, but are only speakers of English. What that tells us is that village English, or it's been called Tsimshian English and Nishka English, there's a couple of papers on it. Gene Mulder, who's coming to Kispiox next week, has written a paper on it. It tells us that your community has taken English over as one of its own languages and started reshaping it to make it distinctive.
So I better stop criticizing.
No, I wouldn't say that. The thing of it is that it's quite okay in its place in the village, but children in the school who, I will say, well, I hope they want, but who need, but that's me saying, who need to learn standard English in order to interact with non-native people on a basis of equality, need to know the standard English. So it's not that they should stop saying this, it's that you learn, you use this with your mates, your playmates are in the village, but when you go to get a job or you're talking with a civil servant or somebody on the telephone, then you use standard English and you say marry and them rather than them marry. But it's that same sort of thing that is responsible, that is, for the creation of whole new languages, what are called Pidgin and Creole languages. Pidgin and Creole languages. So, for example, in Australia, I'll come back to you in just a minute, Charlotte. In Australia, there is a language called Torres Strait Creole, which is spoken by Torres Strait Islanders and some Aboriginal people, which has mainly English vocabulary, but has indigenous grammar and sound system. If you hear it spoken, you wouldn't recognize that it has some common origins with English. But I go talk lo yupla now this kind. I'm going to speak to you guys in this way. This kind blow you me, this way of ours, of talking. It's not an indigenous language that was there before the white fellas came, but it's a new language that has arisen in the course of culture contact and interaction, and which signifies their identity as Torres Strait Islander and as Aboriginal people, as black people, as opposed to white people. And it has like 15,000 or so speakers. There is another language spoken in northwest Queensland, which is very similar. It's called Creole, spelt with a K, that has probably 30,000 speakers, and it's growing. It's spoken from western Queensland across the Northern Territory and out into Western Australia, over several thousand miles. And it's an Aboriginal language, but it's not an indigenous Aboriginal language, and it's tied up with Aboriginality, not with local identities of, we're the people of this place, but we're Aboriginal people, not white people. Now, there's different kinds of these in North America, different kinds of these red Englishes, they've been called, but to my knowledge, they show some similarities, but they're often regionally quite different. In some contexts, it's good to speak this way around white fellas, because it makes them aware that you really are different from them. One of the dangers in speaking really good English with white people is that they'll think you're not Indian anymore. They'll think that you're just like them. So that in the old days, the high-ranking chiefs who would go to Ottawa were immaculate dressers, really fashionable, and often spoke quite good English, although with an accent. And they were following their own cultural ideas about the importance of, they were cosmopolitan people about you show your respect by using the other fellow's dress properly, the other fellow's language properly. But the trouble is the white fellas see that and they say, oh, they've assimilated. Like that. So there are times when it's good to let them know that you really aren't like them. Charlotte and Lillian.
The term red English, is that used in linguistics?
That's not specifically a term from linguistics proper, but in this field of linguistics called sociolinguistics, it looks at language and society. the term red English has been used by a few people on the analogy of the term black English. You all know, I mean, when you turn on TV and you see black people, you don't even have to look at the screen. You can just listen and you can hear the way they talk English. It's
Like America.
Yeah.
They hate them so much they sound like.
Well, what's unfortunate is that, you know, that black American culture is presented on the television as something valuable and something to be emulated, so that all young people, whether white or red or yellow or black, you know, want to become first-class rap dancers and so forth. It's okay if you can take it over and make it into your own rap dancing, but not if you give up your own ways to take those on exclusively. But I put this name on the board. The man who's written the most about Indian Englishes, or Red English, is a man named William Leap, Bill Leap, and you may come across his name. The other person who's written about Tsimshian English is Jean Mulder. She might come next week to belong to a class if she's free. I know she'll be at Kispiox. And on Nishka English, the person who's written on that is Marie Lucie, or Mary Lucy. She's sometimes called Tarpon. She was the linguist for the Niskatam bilingual and bicultural program. Jean Mulder was the linguist in the Tsimshian program 10 years or so ago. Lily.
That whole issue of Red English and Standard English is the reason that many of our children are failing in the school systems because of value judgments being placed on which is better.
Yes.
When really, when you look at the way our children speak, it's our standard way of speaking for us. And there's nothing wrong with it. But when they hit the school system, the public system, we sort of say, well, you should learn it this way.
Yeah. You're exactly right. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. And it is what we'll call the small s standard in your communities. But the mainstream teachers, the mainstream education system don't recognize it in that way and take it as being evidence for poor grammar, or what's even worse, they take it as evidence for intellectual incompetence or intellectual deficiency, when it's not that. You know, all normal people within a community will have a good full language. It'll be either an indigenous language or a pidgin or a Creole. Pidgins are often not fully developed, or another national language. But to come back to what I was talking about yesterday, national standard languages, where you can think of that as standard with a capital S. Many people seem to have the idea that those kinds of languages, that is the language, you know, that's the Queen's English or the King's English, you know, when you have a king on the throne. But I think it's important to realize that those are not natural creations, those are the creations of people. They are the results of authors and of government agencies and education, all agencies, schools and so forth, working towards standardization. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think it's good that we have a single standard English that all English-speaking people around the world can use one with the other to talk, because it opens up, it facilitates cultural and social interaction. And next week I'll play for you a reading selection where you'll hear Australian English, New Zealand English, Irish, Scots, what's called RP, the received pronunciation, you know, the really, I'd say, hoity-toity type of English. In Australia we say the kind of English you speak when you have a plum in your mouth. But you'll see the accent, they sound a bit different, but the grammar and the vocabulary is the same in that standard, capital S standard English, and it makes it possible for people to communicate across national and regional boundaries. But to finish this off, and then get back to grammar, remember what I was saying to you yesterday about multilingualism and bilingualism, that most people in today, most people in past history have known more than one language. Well, extend that to what you might call multidialectalism or bidialectalism, that is quite common for people to have a non-standard variety, which is completely regular, as we know the Village English is, plus the standard language. I've told you how my wife and I, who come from the same hometown, with just the two of us, we talk our hometown way, and I talk very informally, so forth. Whereas if an outsider is there, or I give a lecture like this, then I use standard English. The lesson from that sort of thing for your children is to try to create a situation where they're not penalized and punished for using Village English, but they're given a positive situation or positive inducement to learn standard and maybe build on the non-standard, on the Village English to get the standard better. And then they keep both of them, use them. I know many of you see smiles on your face. This can be a touchy subject, and many people feel that the Village English is just wrong and is poor and it should be eradicated. But I can assure you that you'll never eradicate it. In the same way, in the mainstream communities, teachers have been trying to scrub out ain't for several centuries. And in Australia, in non-standard Australian English, we, instead of saying you for plural, instead of saying you for nism, the non-standard form is yous. I'll see yous tomorrow. And the teachers are constantly trying to, get the kids to stop saying that. They don't. And then you go out to outback Australia and talk with the country people or with working class people, and they use yous all the time.
Yeah.
But they're able to use standard when it's appropriate.
We got an England electrician at the middle, he talks like that. Use guys coming out.
Yeah. It means nism, not neen. It's a way, the use is always plural. Yeah.
He's worked with, I think he went to, Australia or somewhere where he picked it up and he never let it go. It sounds better. Use guys coming.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. We have a house on the coast about an hour north of Brisbane, and when we were building it, I was up there quite a bit and got to know all the workmen. First section, just finish it off before we take a bit of a break, but we've seen how there's good evidence that you have categories, meaningful categories of humanness, animateness, or animacy. Animacy is another way of saying it. And inanimacy, as well as the distinction between proper nouns and common nouns. And the evidence for that was not in terms of prefixing or compounding, but it was selection. We could see that the different kinds of nouns select the appropriate numbers. There's basically three sets of numbers, and that the proper nouns and the common nouns select different connectives or different what are proclitics, singular and plural. Let's take a break now. Grammar with you at the first part of this second session of the morning before I move on to some more sociolinguistics. But I'd like to move to looking at pluralization, or the grammatical category of plurality, or more specifically pluralization, that is how plurals are marked in some alga. You know, what grammatical processes are used to mark plural. And in my mind, there's just no doubt that the most notable grammatical category in Samalga is plurality. For a person learning Samalga as a second language, or for a linguist studying the language, trying to work out what its rules of morphology and rules of syntax are, number is a grammatical category that it immediately hits you in the face, because it's constantly being marked in the grammar, and it's something that displays a lot of irregularity. And there are lots of different ways of marking plurals in the language. And these are things that you have to learn. There's no inherent logic to them. You can't just look at a word and say, oh, you know, the word looks like this. It must form its plural this way. You might get it right most of the time, but there'll be a significant part of the time when you can't. You simply, as a second language learner or as a linguist, you have to observe, you know, what the plural form is and how it's formed. This is not strictly my own observation. As I was telling you the other day, Franz Boas, the great anthropologist and linguist, Franz Boas, who wrote the first scientifically adequate grammar of Niska and of Tsimshian back 80 years ago, actually 90 years ago. Boas, in his grammar of the Niska, Somalia, and Tsimshanam, noted that plurality, you know, plural marking was all over the place. Probably the greater part of his grammar consisted of sections, you know, treating the different classes of plurals. And plural marking is found not only in the nouns, but also in the verbs. Found in the adjectives. I haven't yet taught you how you can tell what a noun is and what an adjective is and distinguish those from other verbs. But we'll do that later. But many stems we'll see can belong to different parts of speech. And sometimes they change their plural marking according to whether they're serving as nouns or verbs or whether as adjectives or verbs. So, for example, axe in the meaning to drink has a plural la-axe, but axe in the sense of wet, as in axed, has the plural axed for plural objects to be wet, not la-axed. I'll put these on the board and they're on your handout. Or zok, to camp, has its plural zok. But when you have a noun, use the same stem in a noun as in unzok. Well, there it's the same, unzok. But on the other hand, if you take a verb like yeah, to go, it has a suppletive plural, which for many people is wilchs or willachs. But when you have the derived form, yeah, to go fast, it's not, the plural of yeah is not a wilchs or a willachs, but aliyet. Aliyet, where the li here tells you that it's plural, and we'll see the t tells you that it's plural. Now, don't memorize these, I mean, just write them down, but the point I'm trying to make is that if you get the plural for a stem, let's say when it's serving as a noun, it may not pluralize the same when it's used as a verb, or if you get it as a verb, it may be different when it's a noun, or it may, if you make a new derived verb from a simple stem, it may pluralize again differently. It's generally possible, though, to tell whether you've got a noun or a verb or an adjective by looking at the form or by putting it into a sentence, and I'll show you later on in lectures how to test for whether you have a noun or a verb or an adjective. Okay, what did you say for? Okay, schlup is the plural for ye in Western Gitksan, and also in Mistak they use that schlup too. And many, of course, many Eastern people recognize the word, understand it in the same way that you understand their word.
The bottom is
These the same, aye, aliyet.
fast.
But the relevance of all of this is that in writing a grammar or a dictionary, you need to identify all the different kinds, the different types of plural formation, and to give at least one example of each. And again, in writing a dictionary, when you list words, you shouldn't just list the singular form, but for every word that has a plural form, you should give the plural there, or at the very least tell what class of plural it belongs to, and then you can, form the plural by a general rule. Like in an English dictionary, typically, but I guess it will give you the plural, if it's a word like boy or girl or cat or tap, without saying much about it. But if you have special plurals like, say, man, men, or brother, brothers, brethren, the dictionary will give you the special plurals and a bit of an explanation along with it. But as I say, it's important in writing a dictionary that you put the plurals in. The other thing, even more important, is that in gathering material, when you're working with older people, you should always get the plural form. The plurals show some variation. I'm sure that the plurals that I've put on the handout here, that not everybody's going to have them the way that I've learned them. And again, I've put them down, and I've learned them from different people. What I've put on here has been primarily Eastern Gitksan that I've learned from Johnson Williams and Sally Hindle. And I deliberately didn't try to put Western forms on because I wasn't sure of myself. But where the Western forms are different, tell me. Question? It's part of the li and the t, it's part of the plural marking. There's a small set of verbs that in their plural form they end in t, and then they'll have li or some other prefix. But the t is part of the plural marking. It's an example of what we'll later on see are called pleonastic plurals. That is, where you have more than one mark, more than one plural mark, pleonastic. Well, I also want to say before we start looking at this handout, I've deliberately said a classification of plural forms in Somalic. This is just one way of classifying the different kinds of plurals, and there might be other ways of doing it, of carving things up or of classifying. And also, as I said, some of you may form your particular plurals in a slightly different way than a particular construction here. But to begin to look at this, we'll see there is a great set of nouns as well as many verbs and adjectives in the language that don't change between singular and plural. They're what are called invariable forms. Then there's a large set of plurals that I have called regular plurals right here. And they're not completely regular, but within the class there's regularity, and there's different kinds of regular plurals. Then there are a set of what I'll call irregular plurals. There's a set of pleonastic plurals of this kind right here, ayet, aliyet, which is not an example there. There's a set of suppletive plurals. Then there are plurals that are formed by using the passive suffix to indicate plurality. And then the proper nouns have their own particular way of pluralizing. So invariable, regular, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 major classes I've got, and then the regular plurals have five subclasses. So lots of different ways of forming the plurals. And as I say, it's something extremely important to get right in a dictionary. And by getting right, I don't mean that there is one correct way. For many words, there may not be one correct way of forming the plural, but there might be two, an Eastern and Western way of doing it. Or there may be some words where there is a single way that everybody agree on. But if there's more than one way, we want to identify that. And again, there may be some ways that are specifically we can identify as young people's ways that you wouldn't want perhaps to recognize in a dictionary. You wouldn't want to promote it. But those are choices you have to make yourself. I mean, it would be like deciding on whether you put drink, drinked, eat, eated into a dictionary. Okay, well, let's talk about these invariable forms. In my work, I've found that what I'll call the specific nouns that signify plants and most animals typically don't have special, not typically, but I'd say universally, don't have plural forms. A word like hast for fireweed, I've never heard a plural for that, a word that means fireweeds, is that just a single word by itself, meaning more than one fireweed plant. Or one for deer, chada for moose. To my knowledge, no special plural forms for them. If there are, tell me, and put them down. However, they can be singular or plural. I mean, you can count them, one deer, two deer, and so forth. And the number marking there is covert, and you can determine what it is, whether it takes, the singular number 1 or whether it's, a number higher than 1. On the other hand, there's one animal that is special, not only in Gitksan culture, but in most human cultures, human societies, namely domestic dogs. And the word that I write as us, pronounces us, but some of you may want to write it as os, os, us. It definitely has a plural. The plural of us, os that I know is what would you have? Plural. Us, us. Won't take, and this will be one of the, it's actually one of the CV1 type plurals there, where you basically reduplicate the first consonant, which is glottal stop. Yeah, the glottal stop, and the second consonant, which is S, and then the vowel changes from U to a short ah there, but us, 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 os. In Western, would that be S, os, or us, os? S, os, okay. Good example where the, and I'll write with an O for you, where the short ah in Eastern corresponds to short eh in Western. Can you think of anything? How about pussycats? Doos. Can you say dis doos? No. See, it's a regular way of forming plurals, but it's just not part of the language. How about doos? Doos. Or doos. Doos. No, not right. But horse, you are done. How about you are done? For horses. Or you are done. Horse, I think, has a plural where you just add that TXW to the end. You are done. You are done, and some people, some of you pronounce it as Gyodan. Huh? Okay. Write it. Say it once more, please, Art. Gyodan. Okay. Art's pronunciation there has a long U. Gyodan. Yeah. Gyodan. Gyodan. That, by the way, is a loan word that comes into Somalia from Chinook jargon, and it's quite common throughout the Pacific Northwest, and its ultimate origin is the real Chinook language that was spoken on the lower and middle Columbia, the lower Columbia River, the real Chinook language, and there they pronounce it as Kiutan. Kiutan. It simply means horse. It doesn't have any meaning other than a Kiutan. What comes in is Gyuaden. So most specific nouns that signify plants and most animals except for dogs and horses, just the same form is used for singular and plural, and the number marking is covert. You can tell by what number you use with it, or whether it takes a singular verb or a plural verb. However, there are some what I'll call generic terms. Generic terms label what are called superclasses. They label kinds of animals and plants, so that there is the generic term kan, which means tree in general, and it can be pluralized to kangan, kangan, singular and plural. Notice, by the way, simkan. What is simkan? Which cedar? Red or yellow? The red cedar. The red cedar is called simkan, literally the real tree or the true tree, just like Somalia, real language, true language.
What's the yellow cedar?
Which? Yellow. Which?
Wish.
Which?
Hard W? Wish?
Which?
Wish. Hard W there.
Can you spell that, Bruce?
If I hear it right, is it, okay, does it have, is it soft W or hard? Is it, okay, soft then, so with. There's another word that I'd have to check that I know for yellow cedar. But anyway, simgan, one red cedar, can you say simgangan? Simgangan for yellow, for red cedars? Okay, simgangan, okay, well there is an example of a specific noun being, does that mean red cedar trees? Yeah, okay. Okay, there's an exception to what I was.
That's the wood, it's not the tree. That's the wood, it's not the tree.
Oh, okay. I'll leave you to ponder these. Yeah, that's what I would have thought there. By the way, and I'd have to say that I'll be learning a fair bit from you as we go through these, because in many ways you have intuitions or feelings about the meanings of the words or whether the plural is correct or not, which as a non-native speaker I don't have, and it's very valuable for me to hear what you have to say. And sometimes where you disagree, your disagreements will help me to understand better what's going on there. But kan then has a plural which is reduplicated, kan, and that generic term, zagwas, animal, and if we compare, which is singular, and it has a plural, yadzas or yedzas, in Western Gitksan, there's a plural there. So putting it into Western, the singular zegwas versus yedzas. Yedzas. Animals. And notice these end in ASXW, which is a suffix, and the stem part of the word for animal is zek and yets, which are the singular and plural forms of the verb to kill, but the literal meaning then would be something like, what is killed, the thing that is killed. In other words, animals are described in terms of what humans typically do to them, which is not a bad thing, as you might be led to believe just from English notions, because it's the animals provide our sustenance for us by allowing us to kill them and to eat them. Okay, and I say also many verbs and many adjectives are invariable. Let me ask you, as an example of a verb that I think is, well, which I've learned it as being invariable. Get back. Get back. Get back. To wait for. Now, if I say, Gebayish hanak, I waited for the woman. See if that sentence is okay. Well, let me just say this. This sounds better, so you don't get the wrong idea about me. Gebayish nexi. I waited for my wife. But how about if I waited for the children? Can I say Gibeyi,
Geet.
Kubat. Making sure that it's plural here by putting the kuba in. Gibeyi, Kubat, Kish. Does that sound all right? See, I'm not changing it. I'm not saying gich gibeyi. Not changing the plural. It's gibeh, I think, is one of those stems that it simply for singular or plural objects it remains the same. How about
My dad, well, this might be my dad, when he told me to wait for other people, he just makes the long vowel, Gibe.
gibeh? That's very interesting.
That's how I know what he's talking about, Gibe. You want to wait for a whole bunch of people, Gibe. So I can distinguish that, Gibe and Gibe.
Okay. So for you, I should say gibeish, Kubat, Kish.
Gibe.
Okay. So for some people, it's invariable. For other people, it's not. Just going on the basis of what I'm hearing this morning and what I think I know, but I could be wrong. And, you know, a committee, that's why in doing dictionary work, one person can't do it. You need a committee to talk these things over and decide. How about ha'o? I'm going home. Dem ha'ot ni'i. How about dem ha'ot nu? We'll go home. Is that all right? Okay. For many people, ha'o is invariable. Ha'o is spelled this way. H, short A, short W. And would you say he'o in Western or ha'o? Ha'o, okay, like that. And chdech, to eat with someone. Dem chdei'nin, I'll eat with you. Dem chdei'nisim, is that all right? Dem chdei'nisim or dem chdei'nidid. Again, see, the verb is not changing. The verb is not changing, you know, with the singular or plural objects. It's simply invariable. I just realized I don't have an adjective right now, and I really need an adjective example. Okay, now we get on to the class of what are called regular plurals. And actually, I think I'd like to stop this part and, you know, come back to the regular plurals on Monday. I'd like to shift over and talk about sociolinguistics now. Okay, well, yesterday, in the second session, I began to talk to you about sociolinguistics and telling you how many different languages there are in the world and how many in the New World and how many in North America there were, how many in British Columbia. And I pointed out to you that the number of languages in the world today, even though there's still 5,000 languages in the world today, that 500 years ago, before Western Europeans began to spread themselves around the globe and to colonize other countries and areas, there would have been many, many more languages, if not 10,000, certainly several thousand more than just 5,000. And that in North America, in America and Canada alone, we know that at least half of the original 250 languages have gone extinct as people, not simply that people died out, but they shifted from their own language so that their descendants now speak English or Spanish or Portuguese if they live in Brazil. I then went on to say that of the world's 5,000 languages, more than 50 but less than 100 include what are called national standard languages, using LG as the abbreviation for language. And English, for example, is or has a national standard variety. French has a national standard variety. Dutch, so forth. National standard varieties have certain characteristics like official status in a country. They're used in the public life of a country, official status. They're used in the public life of a country, in the courts and in government, in the schools, and so forth. Thirdly, national standard languages always have a body of written literature. There are books available in the national standard language, but it's also used, for government documents and advertising and so forth. That the norms of grammar, the norms of pronunciation, the norms of how you use words, the norms of the language are codified and written down so that there are grammar books and dictionaries and there are textbooks that are used for teaching the language to foreigners as well as teaching the standard language to children. And 5, that the standard language is not only a medium of instruction, but it's used as an object of instruction in the schools. An object of instruction. That is, when we go to school in English-speaking countries, we take a course called English, where we learn the standard language. We learn to read and write it, and we learn words and grammatical constructions that we don't learn in the family or in the small local community. There's a great difference between, the non-standard varieties we learn at home and in the neighborhood, or in the village, as the case may be here, and the national standard language. The major point here is that, for the most part, you learn a national standard language through formal instruction, whereas non-standard varieties you learn informally in the family, in the community, in your everyday life. And it's an interesting question to look at specific languages in terms of these criteria. I was giving the example yesterday of Indonesian, which as a national standard language dates only from the independence of Indonesia after World War II, what, about 1948 or 49, when Indonesia finally was recognized and taken into the United Nations as an independent country, free of Dutch colonial rule, even though they declared their independence earlier. But it has a national language called Bahasa Indonesia, which, is being developed. They're still working on the norms and so forth, and its written literature is not perhaps as big as the literature of Balinese or Javanese, and it's very much an object of instruction, taught in the Indonesian schools, so that little kids who are by region might be Minangkabau or Dayak or Javanese or Balinese, not only You know, they've learned their own language, but they learn the standard Indonesian language as part of becoming Indonesian citizens and coming to feel themselves as part of a new Indonesian nation. We look at some Alyaf, our language, the one that we're considering in here, that within its own territories, it doesn't yet have official status so far as the mainstream society is concerned, but it could well have. It certainly is used in the public life, you know, a lot in the feasts and other ceremonies. Doesn't yet have a written literature, but could have, and hopefully something will develop from this course and this work. And similarly, the codifying of norms is what we're thinking about and beginning to talk about in here. It has become a medium of instruction already. To some extent, it's used with some of the smaller kids, and as well an object of instruction we see, you know, around us in the classroom. So that what I'm getting at is that standard languages are not something that exist in nature apart from human societies, but it's human beings, you know, the members of particular nations or peoples who, through conscious and unconscious action, can develop a standard language. And there's no reason in principle why some Alyaf can't be so that a standard some Alyaf can't be developed. And that probably is a desirable thing to do in coming decades in order to strengthen it and to keep it going. In fact, I would dare say that if you don't make the switch over to reading and writing it regularly and teaching it, develop written literature, that it will be, if not impossible, it will be much more difficult to keep it going in this kind of modern society, which is different from the old society, where you've got all the pressures of mainstream Canadian and North American culture on you. The next thing that I moved on to, and the new material I want to get into, is the question of dialect versus language. Dialect versus language, or language versus dialect. What do these terms, language and dialect, mean with respect to each other? And I told you that there's several ways. There are at least 4 ways when people use the term language and dialect, 4 different senses to each one of these. One is simply that that language varieties that stem from a common source are called dialects. So that English and German, Swedish, Danish all come from a common source. And you read the older literature, they'll be described as Germanic dialects. Not simply Germanic languages, but Germanic dialects. And similarly, Boaz, when he talked about the Tsimshianic languages, he talked about Niskat, or Nas, and Tsimshian and Gitksan as Tsimshianic dialects, where what he meant was that they come from a common origin. But there are many people, particularly anthropologists and historians, who don't actually know the situation here, who will use that term, dialect, and what they mean is that, well, basically, they're using the term language versus dialect in the second sense, that language varieties which are mutually intelligible are said to be dialects of the same language. So a dialect is a part of a language. A language consists of a number of different dialects. The English language in this sense consists of Canadian English, Australian English, American, New Zealand, South African, and so on. But quite often the material you read with respect to your own people doesn't make that plain, and it implies that Gitksan says it's a dialect of the Tsimshian language, implying, you know, that our language here is the same as down on the coast. So I'm just reading this book called Mission on the Nass, and he says, the Nishka are a branch of the Tsimshian Indians who occupy the Nass River Valley. They speak a dialect of the Tsimshian language. A second element of the Tsimshian people are referred to as the Tsimshian or coastal Tsimshian. They occupy the area of the lower Skeena River and the north coastal area of British Columbia. The third group are the Gitksan people, who are located in the upper valley of the Skeena River, where they are neighbors to Athabascan people of the interior of British Columbia. All of that, as I read it, implies that you have just one Tsimshian language, and, you know, there's Coast Tsimshian and, you know, the Nass dialect and the Gitksan dialect, and they can understand one another. And as I'll go on to say, in my experience and from what people have told me, that is not true. But in this second sense, then, the key criterion for deciding whether two language varieties is whether they are mutually intelligible or not. Mutually intelligible or not. That is, you know, people speaking one variety, a person speaking one variety, talking to a person who speaks another variety, can they understand each other straight away without having to learn each other's words or each other's slightly different grammar? And that's something that is often very difficult to determine, because humans also have this great ability to learn second languages and to learn other dialects. I think I gave you the example before when my wife and I were here in '82. We saw an Australian film at a film society in Hazleton called Newsfront. And the people in it, was made in Australia, they were talking broad Australian English. And many of the people there couldn't understand, and so I translated into North American English for them. But to my knowledge, from what older people have told me, that when they first hear, or in their lives, when they first heard Niskaam, you know, they could understand it and follow it. It is mutually intelligible at first go, but to understand it fully, you begin to learn new words. It's like when I went to Australia, I had to stop saying elevator and say lift. And instead of saying I have been, I tend to say I have been. That the morphology or the morphemes are a bit different. What we call habas, they call hapisku, where it's the same hap, cover, same stem as in habas, but the word is pronounced a bit differently, and the construction, while it's the same, it is slightly different. Mutually intelligible, but on the other hand, people have told me when they heard Tsimshian, the coast language, for the first time, like when they went down to the Canaries, couldn't understand it. I recall you talking about the first time you went to the Canaries when you were a kid, and you talked our own Smalgif, and you heard people talking Tsimshian, and you said it was a foreign language. It's not immediately mutually intelligible, but it's close enough that it's easier to learn than, say, to learn Wet'suwet'en, which is a quite different kind of language. Well, see, by those criteria, because Niska and Gitksan languages are mutually intelligible at first go, the linguist would say those are dialects of the same language. That is, the linguists would say that. And so, for example, actually I was the first person, the first linguist to study Gitksan language. And when I first started publishing articles in the late 60s, I talked about a language which I gave the name Nas Gitksan to. I called it Nas rather than Nishka because Boaz had called it Nas 80 years or 50 years before. And I called it Gitksan because people were using that term. On the other hand, I think many of us would feel now that they're not really the same language, that there is a difference there, and I'll come to that in a minute. Whereas the Coast Tsimshian is a separate language because it is not mutually intelligible. It's not mutually intelligible. Okay, let me tell you some problems with this notion of mutual intelligibility. Because they bear on issues of language planning and developing teaching and pedagogical materials. Let me describe a situation that's pretty common in Europe. In many European countries, you not only have a standard language, so that in Germany, what used to be East and West Germany, but in what's now the Republic of Germany, Federal Republic of Germany, there is a standard German which is called Hochdeutsch, High German, which is the national standard language. But people who live in villages and rural areas or in other regions often speak what are called non-standard varieties or Mundarten, dialects. And quite often the dialects are not mutually intelligible with the standard language. And the children come into school speaking just their own local variety, and they get hit in the school with standard High German, and it might as well be English or French because it's that different. But they move them, you know, they start teaching them in their own dialect first and then move them on into standard German. But later in life, well, as they go on, they keep it up. This is true in Norway, in Sweden, in Denmark, in most European countries. But to come back to the point I want to make about mutual intelligibility, you can travel from Amsterdam to Berlin, and let's say if you do it along the coast, well, you can travel from Amsterdam into one of the North Coast German cities, where if you stop every few kilometers and listen to the non-standard varieties, the local dialects, not to the High German, there's never a place where you find a break and you say, Dutch ends here and German begins there. What technically are called the Low German, low for spoken in the lowland areas, the Low German local dialects are continuously distributed across the Dutch and the German national, German territory along the coast. The same way you can travel from Paris to Rome, and if you listen to the local varieties, the local non-standard, what people speak in the villages and the small towns amongst themselves, and you will never find a place where you can say French ends here and Italian begins there. Whereas standard French and standard Italian are obviously separate languages. So that it's quite often the case that mutual intelligibility, that varieties can be mutually intelligible with each other, but you wouldn't want to say that they belong to the same language, that, the non-standard Dutch varieties You wouldn't want to say they're a kind of German. Well, you could, using just this one criteria. You wouldn't want to say they're a kind of German, or that the varieties spoken on the German side are a kind of Dutch. But most people would say the ones on the Dutch side are a kind of Dutch. The ones on the German side are a kind of German, because people on either sides of the boundary look to their own national standard language for borrowing and to read and write. To read and write. So that here you have cases, there are lots of cases then where there's mutual intelligibility, but people regard that mutual intelligibility as not really what's most important for deciding where one language ends and another one begins. They use some other criteria for that, political or social. Political or social. The third way of distinguishing between language and dialect, I'll come back to these notions later because, well, let me, before I go into this, in countries where you have, you know, local non-standard varieties and a standard variety, we often refer to that as a situation of diglossia. Diglossia. And it's actually a good thing, and it's something to aim for here. It's what I was saying earlier, you know, where people use Gitksan for Gitksan things in feasts in your own public life, but then use English for relations with the broader world or with non-native people. The next distinction between language and dialect essentially is the language variety a national standard language or a standard language variety? You might say standard with a capital S, as opposed to a non-standard variety. A non-standard variety. Remember that a standard language with a capital S, or national standard language, has those 5 or so properties I was talking about. Whereas we were talking earlier about village English, or I've told you about my non-standard English or non-standard Australian, it doesn't have those properties. And to come back to what Lillian was saying, even what we call non-standard is in a sense standardized in the sense that it's conventionalized. It has its own particular rules. It's not just a mishmash or a hodgepodge there. Well, quite often people, and this is common in Europe as well as here, is that only standard languages are real languages. Any language which isn't standardized or doesn't have a standard variety is just a dialect. And I'm sure the judge in the Dalgam case, when he talked about, you know, Gitksan dialects or Indian dialects, he had that in mind.
There's one place in the transcript where he's referring to Mary Johnson's evidence, and he said, must she speak in the dialect? Which indicates it's something less than a language.
That's exactly, that's a good point there. It's a way of putting down people's languages by denying them the status of full language, of just saying that it's a mere dialect. And as I was saying earlier, I developed this term Nas Gitksan, which was in a linguist sense, you know, the language that consists of Nispamch and Gitksanamch. But over time, you know, and I try to explain to people, well, you know, you speak the Gitksan dialect of Nas Gitksan, or you speak the Nas or the Nishka dialect of Nas Gitksan. I can say that, but the fact is that it flies in the face of conventional experience where a dialect is something less than a language.
Our non-standard, and it's called
idioms. No, an idiom is something else, but a term that is close to idiom that you might be thinking here is idiolect, which means one person's particular way of speaking. But to come back to this, the difference between language and dialect in terms of whether it's a standard language or not, a sort of humorous way of putting it is that there's no structural difference between a non-standard and a standard language variety. But as one guy put it, a language is just a dialect with an army and a navy. In other words, it's attached to, a powerful state organization. Delia.
How could it be just a dialect? If our language is just a dialect, it's a dialect to what? I mean, doesn't it have to have a language base to be a dialect?
No, see, in this second sense, dialect is to language. Dialect is to language as part is to whole. The language is the whole set of dialects, and a dialect is just part. It's not like non-standard German and standard German where there is a difference of development in terms of writing and so forth there. But in this sense, Gitksan, you're not judging it against Niskam, but it's simply that it's part, it's a mutually intelligible language variety within a grouping that also includes Niskam. And what I'm getting at now is a fourth way of looking at the relationship between language and dialect, which I've been forced to come to over time. That, yes, as a linguist, I'm right in saying there is a Gitksan language defined in terms of mutual intelligibility, and
Could you reverse that thing?
yeah, we call it the Gitksan-Niskai language, or the Gitksan-Nas language. Then they get even madder at me.
Well, that's what
But
you're trying to do here now.
Yeah, but the point that I'm getting at here is not that that way of thinking is incorrect, but that if you really want to understand how a language variety is distinctive and how it is traveling its own way, it's making its own way, its own road as it moves through time and changes, you have to understand the relationship between a language and its people. And the Gitksan people are a separate people from the Niskai people. If you are separate nations. Separate nations. Right. We'll expunge it now, but when you go sometime later perhaps and you read articles I've read and you see that term Gitksan, you think to yourself, no, I know Bruce Rigsby's changed his mind. I know he's changed his mind about that, so I'm not going to get mad at him. But the fourth way, which I'll just introduce and say a bit about it now, is that we linguists and sociolinguists have to accept the norms and values, the evaluations that the native speakers of the language variety themselves make, and how they see themselves as either distinctive from other peoples, or as closely related to or even part of the same peoples there.